Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining. I will get started right away while people continue to log on. We have a 1-hour webinar today with 3 speakers, and we have lots of new information to share with you. I'm Frank Lohmann, Senior Director of Building Science here at CHBA, and my co-host today is Sarah Karen, Director of Renovation Services. Today's webinar is the 7th in our never-ending series, Public Reviews for the 2025 National Construction Codes. And today's subject is accessible dwellings. If you want to circle back on any of the previous webinars, please use the QR code on the bottom right of the slide to get to the recordings. They're also easy to find. If you go to our newly designed website, you can find them under Resources and CHBA Webinars. The recording of today's webinar will be available on the CHBA website to CHBA members, usually within a day, in case you can't stay to the end or if you want to listen to a certain portion again. We're also posting the PDF documents of the slide deck for each presentation on the same webinar. I also want to let you know that we have muted all participants so that there are no distractions. And because we do want to make the webinar a bit interactive, you can ask questions throughout by writing them in the question and answer panel by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window. We may answer some of your questions live during the webinar or by responding on the Q&A panel. As always, we'll have a few polls for you. So Sarah, let's try this off. I think we have now 130, almost 140 participants. So we're still ramping up. It seems a little slow today, but let's start with the first poll. See where people are coming from. And if you're just joining us now, you see the poll window, hopefully, and you can just click where you're from, where your major primary is. We apologize. There's not a full list of all provinces and territories because Zoom actually has a limit of. Ontario, Quebec is battling against BC and the provinces right now. The rest of you can't see that, but a few Atlantic provinces, about 8 or so. Good. We're getting up to 160 participants. That's great. I think this looks like about 30% BC, 20% prairies, and almost 40% Ontario, Quebec, with 8% Atlantic and a few people from National. That might just be our speakers. Oh, no, they can't participate. Never mind. Okay, good. Thank you for everyone, and welcome to those who are just joining us. Oops, I have to scroll here for last housekeeping item. You can manage your own view of the webinar and make the PowerPoint bigger or smaller by sliding the dividing bar. And just again, to reiterate, the purpose of this series, of the entire series, is to inform you about the code changes that are out for public review right now and which ones are still coming. We're hoping we can help you understand what's being proposed and that we can guide you in your own review, or that you can provide us with feedback as to what you would like to see in our public review comments that we submit on behalf of our members. We also hope that all the groups and professions in our membership find this equally helpful. So let's try another poll right now to tell our speakers who's represented in today's audience. So you'll see some choices there. Hopefully this will be close enough to one of the categories. See lots of site builders and modular builders and developers. Quite a few architects and engineers. That's good to see. I'm happy. Few renovators, 1% growing. Municipal planners, some code officials, some energy advisors. Oh, we have the whole palette today. That's great. We're now at 170 participants. We're a good 80%, I think, responded. So this is really interesting. I've never seen a webinar before where there were so many architects and engineers. So this is great. It's good for us to know which audience we're reaching. Good. With that, let me get to finally introduce our speakers. Brigitte, Potvin, and Vicki Komisar are 2 technical advisors from Codes Canada. Both have extensive experience in working with accessibility standards and research. They've both studied biomedical engineering. Vicki previously worked as an assistant professor of mechanical engineering at UBC's Okanagan campus and as a researcher at Simon Fraser University and Toronto Rehabilitation Institute University Health Network. She led several projects on how the design and use of mobility aids and built environment features, like handrails, for example, affects the risk for falls and injuries, especially in older adults. She also co-invented, developed, and commercialized two stanchion-like balance and walking aids with industry partner Heart Mobility. Brigitte's experience includes supporting research on injury prevention at Simon Fraser University, focusing on contexts that include falls on older adults and head impacts on collegiate hockey. She also designed experiments to make people fall in the dark onto furniture on purpose for science and onto cushioned mats. I'm only reading what she gave me, so these are her words. Brigitte and Vicki have a wealth of knowledge on the topics we will be covering today, and they will talk about the code changes on accessibility, adaptability, and visitability. Our third guest is Gary Sharp. I suspect that many of our participants will know Gary because he's been in the building industry for over 30 years, involved in both new home construction and renovation. Gary is a former CHBA staff person, and during his time with CHBA, he was directly involved with the producing of the Adaptiv Home Manual and the Adaptiv Home Training course. Gary is an instructor for the course, and he will be providing us with insights as to how the CHBA manual and the course came together as it did. On behalf of CHBA, I do want to thank all three of you for talking to us today. This is a new subject for many builders and renovators, and as we just saw, for many of our members, architects, engineers, municipal planners, really the whole spectrum of our membership. And I suspect we will have a few more webinars on this subject. On this slide, really, I just want to point out that there are a number of public reviews happening. The one we're talking about today is the winter 2024 public review. It runs until April 29th, so that when ours and your comments have to be submitted on April 29th, which is next Monday. Then there are two more, spring 2024 public review ending July 27, and another one in the fall 2024, which is reserved for the updating of all reference documents in codes. And you see the publication date planned on the bottom. So all to say, our webinar series may yet to continue. And before I pass it on to Gary for the next presentation, I just would like to point out CHBA's position on accessibility and visitability. It was last updated in 2019 when the Commission on Codes at that time was developing a policy paper for the changes that we're now seeing. I'm going to read you the first paragraph from that position paper. CHBA supports the participation of all individuals in society and recognizes that society does not always accommodate every individual's needs, and that this can limit their participation in society. CHBA supports accessibility and visitability as it applies to facilities and services open or provided to the public. Conversely, CHBA recognizes that Canadians view their homes as a private space, a space they expect to tailor to their individual needs, wants, and budgets, and hence should not be subject to requirements in this area that further reduce affordability and in many cases would not provide the desired outcome. It highlights, so the position paper also highlights the need to protect affordability and choice and the importance of meeting individual needs. It also states that accessibility should be addressed through voluntary efforts, like our Adaptiv Home program. And that is really the cue for Gary to take it away with his presentation now.
Okay, thanks very much, Frank.
Gary will share his screen.
I'm going to share my screen, yes. And
see your background.
Here we go.
There you go. That's it. Excellent.
Looks good. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about here for the next few minutes is I'm going to provide you with some stats. I'm going to talk a little bit about CHBA's involvement, how they got involved with this adaptive home renovation or home modification, as we called it earlier. And I'll show you a few things that the things that we're doing right now. So here's some stats. We've got an affordability problem in Canada. This was from just the end of last year. 22% of Ontario households can't afford single-family home. That's true all across the country. We've got 8 million people So in 2022, 27% of Canadians aged 15 and older had some form of disability. And that's up from 2017. So essentially what that is the baby boomer wave moving through, getting older. We know that consumers and seniors want to live in their home as long as they possibly can. So 75% want to age in place. So those are seniors who are 60 years old and over. So we're having a problem with affordability of new houses, and we've got seniors who don't want to move out of their existing houses and move into apartments and make those houses available. If we dig a little deeper, we see that the average age of people becoming having some mobility issues or flexibility or dexterity issues, 53 years of age. First-time home buyers, 24% under the age of 30, 33% between 30 and 34, and 43% were 35 or older. Remember that the earlier slide, the age was 53 when people started to see some mobility issues starting to happen. The National Building Code. The National Building Code is intended to be a minimum standard. And keep in mind that any code changes or requirements that go into the National Building Code are heavily scrutinized for both cost effectiveness and to try and prevent unintended consequences. Now, standards, whether they're CSA, UL, whatever, or any guidelines that might be produced, they don't receive this same level of scrutiny. So when a municipality, for example, adopts a standard or a guideline, that is essentially means that it's a code change without the due process being done. So those are things that worry builders. One of the things I want to point out here is basically halfway down the chart. You can see this is reasons why people are buying a home in Canada by age group. And this one right here, it's how I'm saving for retirement. So you can see the green and the blue lines here. That's people aged 18 to 34 and 35 to 44. They're out in front. That's how they want to save for retirement. And historically in Canada, that's what people have done, is they have bought a house, they paid the mortgage. By the time they're ready to retire, they have the house paid for, the house is appreciated in value, and that's their retirement plan. So with that data in mind, the stage has now been set for home modification. So young people, they don't need accessible homes. What they do need are homes that they can afford, and they need to get into the market as soon as possible. Older people don't want to give up their home. They want to stay in that house as long as they possibly can. Older people have got equity in their home. Their house is appreciated in value, and so they have access to financing and funding if they need it. And with regard to disabilities, every disability is unique. So one size does not fit all. Depending on the disability that people have, it will affect the renovation that needs to be done. So CHBA's vision was that the code needs to continue to keep housing safe, and it needs to provide affordable, especially for first-time home builders. CHBA also wanted to make sure that renovators were properly trained to supply an aging population with the appropriate modifications to support them if they became disabled. And in the case of new home builders, if new home builders want to voluntarily provide accessible houses for their clients or to target a more senior market, then they should have access to the best information to support their choices on what features they're going to put into those houses. And CHBA has become a trusted voice in the housing technology sector through the CHBA Builder's Manual, which has been used for decades now to train students. So what did we do? To start off, we initially said, well, hey, there's a program in the USA. It's called the Certified Aging in Place Specialist. We tried to adapt that program to Canada. We called it CCAPS. So the Canadian Certified Aging in Place Specialist. We piloted that course in London and in Peterborough and the Kawarthas through our home builders associations, and the members were less than excited about what they saw. The main criticism was that there was a lack of, the meat and potato stuff, and it was too big picture. So, excuse me. Essentially, they were asking, how do we really do this stuff? So we went off and created the Adaptive Home Manual and the Adaptive Home course. And so I'm going to show you just a few things here about, let's talk about the manual first. This is some of the stuff that you'll find in the manual. If you look at the very first point here, falls are a big deal. And you heard that that Vicki has been doing a lot of research on falls, but falls are the leading cause of injuries in older Canadians. Jump down to this one. Every 13 seconds, an older Canadian is treated due to a fall. And falls are the prime reason for people moving out of their house. So what we want to do is keep people from falling. No slippery floors. And in the course, we talk about how you know that based on testing on flooring. What you may not know that some people with dementia shuffle their feet when they walk, so carpet can become a tripping hazard, and throw rugs, of course, become quite dangerous. Grab bars, zero threshold doorways, curbless showers, all that kind of thing is all part of the course and all part of the manual. We also talk about stairs. These are not code minimum stairs. These are 711, which some of the advocates for accessibility say is a better stair. So we talk about what makes a stair a better stair. We talk about empathy, walking a mile in their shoes. Many of the renovators out there are the most healthy people around. And you are going to a meeting with someone who is almost exactly the opposite of you. Someone who is mobility challenged and may not be able to, move or get around as quickly as you do. So you need to have some empathy for these people. Space requirements. Wheelchair, standard wheelchair, power wheelchair, scooters. How much space do you need? Reach ranges. Side reach. Forward reach. All of this is in the manual. We talk about ramps. So one of the big questions, how do you get your client from the street into the house? A ramp is one of the more popular options, but how do you build a proper ramp? How do you do a curbless shower? We talk about that in the course. Then we've got the course. And the course is 2 days and excitement, without a doubt. We try in the course to minimize the amount of time that you're away from the job site if you're a renovator or a builder. So part of the course consists of pre-course materials that we send out. Some of it is just things that you already know or have got some experience with, like contracts, and marketing, and insurance. Other is things like privacy, professional partners. We're talking there about physiotherapists or occupational therapists to help you figure out what renovations you should be making for a client. Some demographics and some client communications, that kind of stuff. So things that you can study for ahead of the course. Then when we get into the course, we've got a full day, a pretty solid day one, talking about ramps and home entrances and bedrooms, closets, stairs, flooring. And that part of the course, we've got live instructors, whether they're on video or whether it's, face-to-face. And we've also got some instructional videos from other instructors, just so you don't get bored listening to one person or two people for the whole day. And then day two is more exciting. This is when we put it all together. So we go through at the beginning about an hour-long recap. It's really a rapid fire of everything from the pre-course materials right through till the end of day one. This is the kind of stuff that's going to be on the exam and the things that should kind of roll off your tongue as as an adaptive home renovator. Then we start to work on 3 separate case studies altogether. And this is the part that I call the wow part, because of the sessions that I've done, there's always been new ideas in every session. People get pretty excited. They get pretty passionate about how they're going to modify these houses. And we look at 3 types of clients. One is the client with no immediate needs. So that would be somebody like myself who's getting older, but still physically pretty active. This is a great opportunity if someone's looking for a kitchen reno to start to put in, movable pantries and those types of things, and lower levels for the island, so that there's a place for a seated person to work, that kind of stuff. We've got progressive needs. These are things like dementia, macular degeneration, any kind of muscle type disorders, people that are getting worse as time progresses, and what those houses are going to need in order to support that person in their house. And then we've also got the traumatic one. So traumatic could be a car accident, sports injury, could be heart attack, stroke, that type of thing. Some type of an injury where people's lives change forever. And then there's a final exam, which is made up of 50 multiple choice, score 70% to pass. And this is how you register for the course. So I'll leave that slide up for a minute in case people want to write down the address. And we've got courses coming up. The next round of courses is May 28th and 29th.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks.
So this is great information. Yeah, and it's good that while the slide is up and before Vicki and Brigitte take over the screen, maybe we'll at this point entertain 2 more polls, potentially 2. We'll see, and maybe we'll even have time for a question. Although I don't see any in the panel yet. So what we'd like to know here is if you have done any new builds or renovations, how many of them included accessible or some kind of a form of some accessibility features in the design. Oh, this is really good. Because I was afraid that we would be at the 0 here, but this is excellent. So currently the less than 25 and 25 to 75 battle it out here. For those of you can see it, can't see it yet. And we're about 80% on the response rate. There we now have 216 participants, which is a great number. So about half, a little bit more. Yeah, exactly. So now you can see it. So this is a great result, and this will help Vicki and Brigitte knowing what the audience already knows. So less than 25% and between 25 and 75. So those are the 2 largest portions. So that means there's quite a bit of expertise already in the room today, in our virtual room. That's great. This means we can actually ask the next question, because it depends on having people having done actually something. So let's do that right away. For those with experience in accessible design features, was it a new build or renovation with the homeowner's specific needs in mind? So this is obviously, and we see those 2 battling it out right now. It's 50-50, neck and neck. Very interesting. Obviously what we want to know there is, because as you saw earlier, and what Gary explained as well, the CHBA's position is that really the best way is with the owner on site, the owner's needs known, right? But the code changes, and what Vicki and Brigitte might likely talk about is to do before the owner is known. And we're at about half response rate, and those it was 51-49. So if you haven't answered, do it now. It's almost even. That's great. Yeah, I think it's not changing anymore. That's great. Okay, so then we can share the results. You see 50-50, 51-49, working with homeowners to meet their needs and know the needs of the future homeowners were not known. That is a surprise to me, I have to say. That's great. Good to know. So with that, Vicki and Brigitte, whoever wants to lead, that would be your time to grab the screen then.
Okay, I've turned off the sharing from my end, Frank.
Thank you, Gary. That's perfect. We'll see the screen. Excellent. So take it away.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Brigitte, and I'll be presenting a couple of slides of this presentation, but most of it will be Vicki in a few moments. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. Vicki, if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick outline. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about accessibility in the National Building Code as it is now, I suppose, and a few upcoming proposed changes for the 2025 National Building Code for those like kind of general public buildings. Then Vicki will take over with the maybe more interesting part of the presentation for adaptability and visitability of dwelling units. And then I'll just have a couple of words on what you might expect from us for the next code cycle and how to get involved in case you didn't know already. So you can go to the next slide. So again, I'll start with accessibility and kind of the more public, the non-dwelling unit buildings. You can go to the next. Okay, so basically accessibility, there's a lot going on both at a policy and a technical level. It's been kind of an evolving thing in the world and as well as locally on the federal, provincial and territorial level. There's lots of new initiatives coming through and new legislations like the Accessible Canada Act, for example. And all this stuff is kind of underlining the need to kind of all move generally in the same direction and try to harmonize where possible, while also keeping in mind that different regions might have different needs, whether it's their demographics or their readiness to adopt changes for their buildings, for example. On a policy level, it's kind of closer to home within the CBHCC for us, the board control or kind of overseeing the national codes. They've been kind of working towards expanding the scope of accessibility in the building codes. Again, as Vicki will present in a moment on adaptable and visitable housing, we're also looking to work on egressability. So if we can get all sorts of people with various disabilities into a building, we also need to consider how they will get out in an emergency. So we'll be likely working on that in coming years. You can go to the next slide. So this is a really quick overview of kind of the history of accessibility in the national building codes. So you can see that it's kind of started in 1965 with some optional guidelines. And from there, it kind of evolved over the years with kind of a bigger leap in the last kind of 10, 15 years. But it's really a kind of a work in progress that we'll keep chipping away at for some time still. The kind of more notable line here is the green line, where it's basically nothing until, so for this code cycle, we have some proposed changes around housing. That again, Vicki has all that good knowledge. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So before I pass the microphone on, so this is just kind of a bit of a preview of what you might see in the 2025 National Building Codes when it comes to accessibility kind of in the public spaces. So we have the first three bullets on the list are kind of harmonizing between Part 9 and Part 3. So Part 3 had some requirements and we're kind of trying to match Part 9. So in terms of illumination levels, so that's kind of lighting over escalators, moving walks, and some safety signage so that people can get the information they need to navigate in a building. We have some proposed change regarding protruding objects in a path of travel. So basically saying don't put a random kind of bulkhead or a trophy case in a path of travel that someone who has low vision or is playing on their phones might run into. And potentially cause an injury. We have a proposed change relating to fire alarm pull stations. So it's a clarification that these are controls that a building occupant might need to use, and therefore they need to be accessible. And then lastly, we have as well a proposed change regarding the location for menstrual product dispensers in washrooms. So essentially, if you have one, put it somewhere that a person in a wheelchair can use. So just kind of a disclaimer here, some of these have gone to public review and our committees are kind of working through comments. And some are currently in public review, and then some are going to public review in another month, about a month. So kind of all sorts of things going on. Nothing is set in stone just yet on that front. Okay, so the next slide is kind of falling into Vicki's domain, so I will just mute myself until the last two slides.
Okay, thank you very much, Brigitte. Can you just show a gesture to confirm that you can hear what I'm saying? Perfect. Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. Thanks for joining us. Let's talk ahead now about what's proposed for the National Building Codes under adaptability and visitability of dwelling units. So why bother with accessible features in housing? Building on the statistics and overview that Gary and Brigitte presented, the Canadian population is aging quickly. The number of Canadians over 65 years is projected to rise by 68% between 2017 and 2037. And we're not too far away from 2037 compared to 2017. As the population ages, more Canadians will likely have disabilities. For example, about 10% of Canadians have a mobility disability. But if you look over to the right of the slide, this shoots up to 25% of Canadians over the age of 65 who have a disability that affects mobility. Trends are similar for other types of disability, which affect a good 40% of older Canadians as of 2022. So what this tells us is that long-term strategies are needed to allow Canadians to live in the community for longer as their needs evolve. So in response to the changing population demographics and in keeping with Canada's human rights commitments, the Codes Board gave priority to codifying aspects of accessibility in housing design. In fact, most of the provinces and territories address accessibility way, largely in multi-unit residential buildings. Here's a snapshot of some of the various approaches across Canada. A few provinces address accessibility through their own codes, sometimes focusing on adaptability or visitability or other subsets of accessibility. Others have separate legislation outside the codes on accessibility or address it in publicly funded housing, such as Manitoba. Others adopt the NBC, which prescribes requirements for accessibility in units in multi-unit residential buildings entirely at the discretion of the HJ. And it's a bit of a piece that's buried in Section 3.8. In a lot of cases, the HJ just doesn't bother with it, but so be it. And then finally, others have optional guidance across the province and leave it to the municipalities to enact bylaws to implement measures that meet their needs for accessibility. Let's talk now about accessibility in houses specifically. So as of today, Nova Scotia and Ontario already apply basic accessibility requirements to new builds, to new houses in these provinces. BC will enter that foray in 2025. So starting in the middle, Ontario actually doesn't restrict the application of its accessibility objectives in the codes to houses. So they're actually a bit ahead of the NBC on this front. Ontario also requires backing for grab bars in houses so that people can install grab bars a bit more easily when they need them. Looking at West now, BC just released adaptability requirements that would also potentially expand the accessibility objectives. That part hasn't been shared yet. And also this part has been shared, require grab bar backing in 2025. Finally, jumping out east now to Nova Scotia, all houses need to comply with several basic requirements that aim to make houses more adaptable for aging in place. These include wider exterior and interior doors, restrictions on the height of light switches and other controls, backing for grab bars, and other requirements. A lot of the proposed work ahead for accessibility in houses in the National Building Code is based on what's been done in Nova Scotia and Ontario, with a few tweaks to address some lessons learned from their implementation. So with this national context in mind, here's how adaptability and visitability were considered for the NBC. So starting at the top, adaptable features are those that make it easier to accommodate the changing needs of a resident, such as having to transition to using a mobility aid. This particular code cycle, the proposed changes focus on items that would be difficult or really expensive to change after construction, but are fairly easy and inexpensive to do or to implement at the time of initial building. At the bottom now, visitability requirements are those that allow a person who uses a mobility aid to visit others in their homes. These features provide a no-step entrance, easier access to living spaces on the main level of a dwelling unit, and access to a powder room or a washroom on the entrance level. Okay, so looking ahead to what's proposed for 2025 for the NBC. We'll start with some tweaks to the National Building Code framework, which focus on the accessibility objectives and the application of technical requirements. We'll then dive into adaptability, which focuses on low-cost aspects that would apply to all houses and to some units in multi-unit residential buildings, or MURBs for short. These homes would require wider entrances for mobility aids, reachable controls, and backing for grab bars and washrooms. You'll see that this is a fairly short list of changes, recognizing that there's very few homes or features that can be implemented in practice to make a home truly universal. We'll then wrap up with visitability. So this is a different subsection, different application, and it's intended to apply to some units in multi-unit residential buildings at the discretion of the authority having jurisdiction, but not to houses. The visitability piece expands on adaptability to also address wheelchair access to living and dining spaces and the washroom. As the visitability requirements are a lot more space intensive, the application is correspondingly a lot more limited. Just so folks know what's coming with the public review periods, the proposed changes to the NBC framework and the technical changes for wider entrances and reachable controls are currently out for public review. There's also a public review plan for spring 2024, which will tentatively include the proposed changes for backing for washroom walls and for visitable dwelling units. So I'll dive into I'll expand on the list here of proposed changes in a second, but just before we go into that, we wanted to remind the audience that the code development process is the same as it is for all proposed code changes. So what this means in practice, if we look at the top of the slide, the proposed changes to the NBC framework don't present costs on their own, but they do create a framework to start thinking about adaptability and visitability. They don't mean that every single house is going to require a fully accessible washroom and a ramp to access every door. And you'll see that these features are pretty notably absent from the proposed requirements that affect houses under adaptability. Now, to be clear, certain proposed requirements do present cost implications as well as varied benefits. So in keeping with the codes process, these proposed requirements are all considered individually, just like any other proposed changes that affect safety or energy efficiency or fire protection or any other objective of the NBC. Okay, so let's start with the proposed changes to the NBC framework. So beginning with the accessibility objectives, one proposed change is to remove the exemptions for detached houses and other types of homes that are currently exempt, as is the case in Ontario and to a limited extent in Nova Scotia. This will allow for basic technical requirements that address accessibility in the NBC, such as backing for grab bars. There are also two proposed changes within NBC Division B that address the application of accessibility requirements and the scope of Section 3.8. Just for those who aren't familiar with that, that's the big section in the code that deals with accessibility. These changes will create a new subsection 3.8.4, which will contain the lower cost requirements for adaptability that are meant to be broad application to all houses and to some units in multi-unit residential buildings as required by the authority having jurisdiction. These changes also create a new subsection 3.8.5 to contain the requirements for visitability that would only apply to some units in multi-unit residential buildings, again, as required by the AHJ. Just in case folks are wondering, the reason for this bit on multi-unit residential buildings is that the provinces and territories wanted flexibility in how broadly they applied accessibility requirements to these contexts. So by providing this flexibility, this will allow provinces and territories to tailor the application to meet their local needs and demand for accessible spaces. Just one last point on this before we move on. The application of the existing accessibility requirements is not planned to change. So we've heard a lot of concerns about recklessly applying accessibility requirements intended for public spaces to private homes. That's not the case with what's been done here. All of the technical requirements that are proposed for homes really focus specifically on that context. Okay, so moving on to the guts of the proposed changes under adaptability, which are intended as lower cost requirements that affect houses and some units in multi-unit residential buildings. The first technical piece focuses on helping people to enter and exit the home. Persons who use wheelchairs and other types of mobility aids may find that their home entrances are too narrow to allow them to enter and exit independently. A context might be that catastrophic or traumatic injury that Gary brought up during his presentation, where you might find one day that your house does not meet your needs, with the blink of an eye. So making the home entrance larger after the home has been built is expensive and not always possible depending on how the home has been designed. The proposed change addresses this issue by requiring that at least one entrance to the home have a clear width of at least 850 millimeters. One way to achieve this is by using a standard 36-inch door that is open to about 100 to 105 degrees. For homes with multiple entrances, the designer has the flexibility to choose the entrance that makes the most practical sense, depending on the layout of the home and the outside terrain. While this change focuses on making entrances wide enough for mobility aids, it also benefits anyone who needs a wider entrance for other reasons, like moving furniture or like picking a fridge without smashing their knuckles on the doorframe when they bring it into the house. It has also been implemented in Nova Scotia. So this change on its own will not solve home accessibility in the sense that people may still need to install stair lifts or modify other doors inside the home, but by providing a wider entrance, homeowners have one less home modification to worry about should their needs evolve. Okay, the second proposed change under adaptability deals with controls like light switches. It's important to be able to control the lights and security systems and plug and unplug common products. This can be a problem when these controls are installed too high or too low to be reached easily while seated in a wheelchair. Reaching down low can also be hard for people who don't use wheelchairs, like those with lower back pain or with less severe balance disabilities. Inner corners can also be difficult to reach while using mobility aid. This proposed change addresses the issue by requiring that frequently used light switches, electric outlets, and security systems be installed between 400 and 1200 millimeters above the ground and a minimum of 300 millimeters away from inner corners. This would only apply to controls that are intended to be used often, like electric outlets in the middle of a room or a corridor. It would not apply to controls that aren't often used, such as the plug for your wall-mounted TV, or for your fridge, or your garage door opener, or other fixtures where you might plug in a device once and then not touch it for several months after that. This should allow people to more easily reach key controls in the home while minimizing the need for expensive renovations to change their location. A similar requirement already applies to all houses in Nova Scotia and to all units in multi-unit residential buildings in Quebec. Okay, so we've wrapped up the portion of the presentation dealing with the proposed changes under the winter 2024 public review. We'll just walk you through the changes that are slated tentatively to go to public review in spring 2024 to round out the package for this cycle. Okay, so yeah, no presentation would be complete without discussing grab bars in the context of the codes. Grab bars are common technologies for preventing falls in the washroom, but the design of stud walls can make it difficult for people to install grab bars where they need them because you need to hit the studs. To make it easier for people to safely install grab bars where they're needed, the next few proposed changes address backing for grab bars. They focus on structural strength requirements of the backing material and the minimum wall area for backing around toilets, bathtubs, and showers. Just a quick note that these proposed changes would only apply to stud walls and not to concrete walls. Also, just so everyone's 100%, 1000% clear, these are not a proposal to require grab bars in the home. It's just to make it easier for people to comply with their occupational therapist recommendation to install grab bars in the location that's recommended by the OT. Okay, so the first change for backing deals with structural strength requirements so that grab bars installed in backing don't detach from the wall by mistake. It would require that the material and the method of attaching the material to the wall studs allow grab bars to resist 1.3 kilonewtons of force, as already required in the NBC. Designers can use any material, type of stud, and method of attaching to the stud that they want. This is like existing requirements for backing in Ontario, Nova Scotia, and BC. There's one piece that has been added to the proposed change based actually on request from some of you at CHBA. So to make it a bit easier for designers, builders, and homeowners to comply with these structural strength requirements, the proposed change also offers prescriptive guidance options for wood. So what these options do is they provide guidance on the thickness of the dimensional lumber and plywood that would be needed for a designer to comply with the structural requirement. And they also provide options for how to fasten the backing to wood studs. Other options for materials like metal studs are currently in development. Okay, moving on to toilets and grab bar backing. One common thing that came up in community consultations is that being able to access the toilet independently is a common make or break for aging in place versus having to move into long-term care. It's important for dignity and for not having to rely on incontinence products or needing a caregiver to help someone get to the toilet. To that end, this proposed change prescribes a minimum area for wall coverage beside and behind the toilet. This will make it easier for people to install grab bars to help with getting on and off the toilet on their own. There's an exemption for the sidewall coverage if the toilet is too far from the wall to be reached. And the change would also not apply if the wall of interest is not present or too short, like if the only possible layout in the washroom requires that a door be beside the toilet. The third change under backing addresses the minimum area for reinforcing the wall around bathtubs and showers so that people can more easily install grab bars to access and use their tub or shower. The locations focus on where grab bars are often installed for entering and exiting the shower or the tub, for getting up and down from the bath bench or from the base of the tub, or for avoiding a fall after a slip. The backing requirement is relaxed for prefabricated enclosures of bathtubs and showers, and for tubs and showers that are too far from the wall for a grab bar to be reachable. Okay, so I've wrapped up with the proposed adaptability changes. We'll just run briefly through visitability. Just as a reminder, these proposed changes would only apply to a subset of units in multi-unit residential buildings as required by the AHJ. In these spaces, a barrier-free path of travel is generally already required to access the front door of the unit, so accessibility is built into the common spaces of the building already. These visitability changes are not proposed to apply to houses. So the first change under visitability addresses the path of travel on the entrance level of the home to make it easier to access living spaces, dining room spaces, and a washroom while using a wheelchair. The change proposes minimum requirements that would lead to wider spaces for doorways and corridors and low interior thresholds. Just keep in mind that shared spaces in several modern units are designed to be relatively open concept, so it's a feature that's built into a lot of units anyway. People also need to be able to access the washroom in the home, whether they live there or whether they're visiting. So the second change under visitability requires a powder room on the entrance level of the dwelling unit. This includes providing enough space inside the washroom for a wheelchair to turn, but 1.5 meters in diameter, and allow the user to close the door on their own. It also requires that a sink be a minimum distance from an adjacent wall so that a wheelchair can access it without colliding into the wall itself. Finally, this visitable washroom would also have backing to make it easy for installing grab bars. Occupants could use the extra space for other purposes, such as storing laundry hampers if they don't need it all the time. Okay, so we've wrapped up the visitability overview. Just to recap what's been discussed, starting with the technical requirements. The adaptable dwelling unit means dwelling units with one wider door, switches and plugs within reach, and backing for grab bars and washrooms. Visitable means dwelling units that are adaptable and that also have a wide path in living and dining spaces, and a washroom with a 1.5 meter diameter floor space. There is a proposal to apply the accessibility objective to all types of dwelling units, which is necessary for the adaptability requirements to enter the discussion. It does not mean that all dwelling units need to be fully accessible. All detached houses and other types of dwelling units currently exempt from the accessibility objectives in the NBC would need to be adaptable. For multi-unit residential buildings, the HJ decides on how broadly the requirements apply. In other words, they decide on how many or which percentage of units and MURBs need to be adaptable. The HJ will also decide on how many of the adaptable units and MURBs also need to be visitable. So just to walk you through a very quick example, let's suppose that your HJ decides that 20% of units and MURBs need to be adaptable and 10% need to be visitable. Let's consider a proposed development with 50 detached houses and 2 MURBs, each with 80 units. You can see that on the top of the screen. So starting with adaptable, all 50 houses on the bottom and 32 of the units in each of the MURB units would need to be adaptable. These would have a wider door, reachable switches and plugs, and backing for grab bars. Then, looking at visitability now, 16 of the adaptable MURB units would also need to be visitable. These are shaded in yellow. These would need to have a wider path to access living and dining spaces. They would also need to have a washroom with a 1.5 meter diameter floor space and the constraint on the location of the sink with respect to the wall. I will now hand the floor back to Brigitte to wrap up this piece of the presentation.
Okay, so I just have, I think, two more slides here. You can go to the next one, Vicki. So it's just a little kind of sneak peek at the potential work that we'll be working on in the next code cycle. So the CBHCC, I guess we should have outlined this as the Canadian Boards for Harmonized Construction Codes. They basically oversee the national model codes. Sidebar. So they identified some strategic priorities a few months ago for the next code cycle. There were 7 of those. One of them is accessibility. So under that topic, we will likely have these 4 kind of tasks on our plates for the next few years. Keeping in mind, this is still kind of we're still working on this work plan. So that's, I think, the anticipated confirmation date for that will be sometime in September. But anyhow, so we're looking to work on egressability. So like I mentioned before, it's how to get people out of the buildings, particularly considering those with various disabilities or needs for assistance. We're going to continue the work on accessibility, adaptability, visitability in dwelling units, building on what's been proposed for this code cycle. Again, we're going to continue working on accessibility in buildings in general, so kind of more in the public spaces. And dare I say it, we may be looking at introducing requirements for grab bars or looking at kind of fall mitigation measures in construction. And yeah, so lastly, so just if you are interested and want to get further involved in the code's development process, here's our main website. There you can learn about all our upcoming events and meetings, to whether it's to discuss proposed changes, public review comments. You can find all that information there. You can submit a code change request if you see something in the codes that you think needs work. You can let us know and it will be considered in work planning. You can comment on proposed changes during an open public review. So we've alluded to that a few times in the presentation today. The current public review ends on Monday. So if you were planning to provide some comments, get to it. There's not a lot of time left. We do appreciate all the feedback that we receive on our proposed changes. And lastly, if you would like to volunteer to be on one of our codes development committees for the next code cycle, the application process is open to receive your applications. So this is open until May 6th to be considered for kind of the larger committees that we have. So similar to our standing committee structure that we have now, we have kind of new ones that will be starting in the next code cycle. The application process is still open beyond that, although it might be more focused on kind of manning the task groups on more specific tasks that we have in the works. So please do that soon if you are interested. And the last slide that we have is just kind of a thank you for attending and listening to us for the last little while. Our website again, and if you didn't know already, you can download the national codes for free on our website. And I think there's some other provincial codes that you can get there as well. And that wraps up our presentation. So I guess it's back to Frank to wrap things up.
Yes, just forgot to unmute. Thank you so much. That was great. And I just took the screen back, Vicki, already, leaving it on your slide. And we have some time for questions, very little, but one I'll ask quickly is, will the grab bar backing be required for all washrooms in the unit? That's one question. If you can quickly answer that, because I have a few more questions.
Yeah, I can answer that one. The intent is that it is required broadly for all washrooms. The major reason for this is because when it really comes down to it, we've got an exemption for the prefabricated enclosure. We've got exemptions for where the toilet's kind of in the middle of the room and you can't guarantee that a reachable wall is there for grab bar anyway. So by the time you think of how washrooms are laid out in a home, we're not actually expecting that much grab bar backing to be present, if I'm going to be totally honest. So.
Okay, thank you. And so there's two more questions that I'm going to go and answer or try or ask you after I present one slide that I have here, once my presentation works again, which is really our draft comments, or at this point I would actually just call them considerations. So at CHBA, with our local and provincial HBAs, we've had some discussions, and we're struggling to comment on these proposed changes. And on one hand, we see very simple, seemingly cost-neutral changes, the ones that you presented. And on the other hand, we see a huge floodgate opening with the exemption for private homes from accessibility disappearing. Another big question for us is how the decision of where visitability is required will actually work if the AHJs decide. And so that's a big question mark because it has all governments listed. And our struggle is not necessarily on what should be done or how, because Gary talked about the exact same things, and not even why it needs to be done. We totally understand that. But what our struggle is on whether it should be done post-occupancy with the owner known or pre-occupancy and via codes, and whether it's voluntary or whether it's by national codes. And so based on our review to date, and this may look very dramatic, this slide, but based on our review today, we recommend submitting a do not support comment for the 5 proposed changes, including in the winter public review, along with high-level comments. And here's why: because for us, it has really been difficult, if not impossible, to comment on the impact of the general provisions, that the 1880, 1881, 2028, without really knowing what the details are, because they're coming in the next public review. As you said, they're coming in the spring. I've actually asked to formally requested an extension to the deadline, or lining all pieces up to the spring public review deadline, but I haven't heard anything back. Because I think that would help us really investigate the bigger picture a little bit more, as well as also asking for some provincial feedback. We know that, as you said, BC is exploring with adaptability, and there are some changes and some differences that are not easy to do. So on a high level, we're not convinced that this one-size-fits-all approach in codes will be effective in making homes adaptable or visitable and keeping them affordable. Both of them need to happen. So there are a lot of voluntary policy measures being left on the table that we feel that have not been tried out or enough to justify the conclusion that regulation is the only answer. And so on that, maybe a quick comment back on the green line that you showed, Brigitte. It's not that nothing is done on accessible housing. I think that's what you said. It is that no code requirements exist in codes for private dwellings. And so I think that's a very interesting nuance, because the accessible housing exists. It may not be enough, and I think that's the problem to solve. And we would argue that there is more voluntary action that could be incentivized to do that, which is the perfect cue for the question. And that's why I wanted to answer or present my slide first. So the first question we got today is, are there any incentives like extra density or government grants to encourage developers to make their projects accessible? If not currently available, are there any potential incentives expected in the near future? Does any of the speakers have an answer to that, specifically for construction or development? Because that would be the answer to the question I just posed. Be volunteering? No.
I think that might be a little bit above our pay grade on the at codes, but I do think so. So I know some jurisdictions provide, or they require kind of visitability features for publicly funded housing already. Mm-hmm. But kind of beyond that knowledge, I don't really know what to say.
And that's fine. I just wanted to, because it was the first question we got today, and I thought this is perfect, because that really speaks to the have we really tried out enough voluntary action incentivizing? And so we will maybe take it on and ask if not more can be done. I know there's an accessible home credit. I just applied for it for my mother-in-law. We did a curbless shower, and so it does exist, but specifically for new builds, I'm not aware. Anyway, I do want to get one more question in. And that is, with the push for more houses, intensification, there are a lot more small MURBs, 4 to 8 units being built. Most of these are 3 to 3.5 stories high. They have basement units. Also, most are being built with no parking and very little space left over. even though the inside could be accessible, there's no room for proper ramps or to access it. How will this be addressed?
I can take that one. So that's that was actually one of the major concerns that prompted the first of all, the focus of visitability on MURBs, but also on giving some flexibility to the AHJ. So what we suspect is going to happen, and this is something that the provinces and territories were pretty, I would say, unified on, is that the goal was for the visitability piece is to only apply to a subset of units in MURBs, and really only where there's a barrier-free path of travel that's already required to get to the front door. So right away, you've actually knocked off a lot of the Part 9 ones above the first floor. That's one of that. If you look at city approach in Ontario, which currently requires that 15% of units in large apartment buildings comply with some basic accessibility requirements, my best guess is that might be a direction that some other provinces and territories take, but that's really up to them.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And I think we are at time. So if any one of you has to leave from our audience, we understand that. We might go a little bit longer. Just a reminder, you can access the recording if you go to the CHBA website afterwards. Because there's a few more questions here. Maybe we can do two more questions here. One question is, and I think I know the answer, just will this be required for retrofits as well in terms of renovations, or only to new builds? And maybe you can talk about, Brigitte or Vicki, about the future priorities that the board is envisioning here.
Sure. So when it comes to kind of existing buildings, it's a little bit more of a gray area on what your local AHJ might require from you. Currently for the national codes, we're working on a kind of a task called alterations to existing buildings. We started the work focusing on energy efficiency right now. So in terms of accessibility features, that we don't really have any content on that. It is kind of slated for future work. It's unlikely to be for the next code cycle, so it would be kind of beyond that. So that's kind of as much as I can say for now. Yeah, so I mean, the proposed changes are also to avoid renovations down the line. So hopefully when we have a few of these buildings in the future, if you won't need to kind of rip open your walls to put in a new header and move electrical work and all these things, just to increase your door width a little bit, or to lower all your electrical outlets by 10 centimeters.
So we have two questions about future owners knowing where grab bar backing is and or whether it's present. Have you thought about that? Has that come up in code development discussions?
So it has come up to a small extent. So it's one piece where it is a challenge, obviously, because the backing is hidden behind the wall. And I imagine that's probably come up already in homes where it's already been installed. What we heard is that this is the kind of thing that would likely make it into some kind of plan for the home or description of the home, because who wouldn't want to advertise that their bathroom has been outfitted with backing to install grab bars in the future, and it's again one easier renovation down the road. So our thought was that would come into plans of the home, or specifications rather, but we weren't entirely sure.
Yeah, no, it's just there's an interesting question because it really goes to the point of how much do broad changes that are applied to every home in the country potentially, how much sense do they make in terms of and we do hear, and this is where it's a bit opaque to see what else is coming. So if we agree to and supported, for example, the exemption of housing from the objective being lifted, where does that lead in the future? And because what we're hearing from our own builder members and renovators is that when they voluntarily do some form of accessibility or adaptable or visitable design, and they do not know the owner, and they do multiple units, they often have trouble selling some of these units because people do not want to move in. There's very, very little demand. And so in some cases, we're hearing that builders have to and revert back to a non-accessible design, whether that is grab bars or wider entrances or bigger bathrooms. So we've heard a lot. Again, though, maybe that's where I'll close it because we're almost 5 minutes over now. That's where I think we as an association really like more time to actually look at floor plans and the impact and to make sure that all the costing is actually properly addressed. We're also hearing a lot about soft admin-like costs where the redesign, retooling, a new supply chain, new materials, all of that needs to be learned. So it's a capacity issue as well. And for us to understand this better, this significant change, we would like more time, really. That's likely our comment. It's not going to be very specific because, as I said, the changes themselves look fairly cost neutral and simple. Our issue is really at the higher level. And with that, maybe if everyone can sort of say one last, is there anything you want to share at the end, Gary, Vicki, Brigitte, before we close?
I think just thanks for tuning in and for your attention. And we'll look forward to hearing, from all of you on your thoughts moving forward.
Thanks.
And I'll just say, Frank, we deal with a lot of these issues in the Adaptive Home course and in the Adaptive Home Manual. They are good resources for both CHBA members and anyone who needs one.
I think maybe just really one quick point on the accessibility objective and the presence of features, right? I mean, if you look at Ontario, that they've required backing for quite some time in homes. I can't imagine that the presence of backing has hit sales of all new builds. I could be wrong, but
no, exactly. That was my point. So neither. I mean, we have found one report of potentially unintended consequences of the reachable switches with the electrical code and window placement. That can be a conflict. So we may add some of those comments. And with the grab bar as well, BC, I think, even Quebec and Ontario and Nova Scotia are doing it. So that's one's fairly established. But then for us, it will be important to see that all those are harmonized and that it's not suddenly becoming a best practice. And so this is where we see sort of, when I say floodgate opens, that's where we see problems. Anyway, we could talk about this longer. My promise is we probably will have another webinar on this topic. So everyone, Gary, Vicki, Brigitte, don't go too far away. Thank you so much for presenting. And thanks, Sarah, for helping me. Last thing I say is that the slide deck will be available and the recording will be available on our website. And I can't even promote our next webinar because for now we don't have one, but there's another public review. So stay tuned. Maybe June, July, we'll have another webinar on code changes. And with that, I'll let everyone go. Thanks for staying a little longer. We still have 120 people. Thanks for holding out and have a nice Friday afternoon.